Hello, Book Stew viewers and listeners. I'm always on the lookout for local authors, and I was really excited a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, when I was perusing the Sunday Boston Globe book section to see a familiar name as someone who was giving a reading at Porter Square Books, which is a great local bookstore in Cambridge. And amazingly enough, it was Jean Trounstine, who has been on Book Stew twice. The last time, though, was 11 years ago. And she's back. Welcome, Jean. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you for that sweet introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, this is the book that we're going to be talking about today is your latest book. And it's a work of fiction, which you don't usually, or you hadn't done previously. So let's talk a little bit about the book, and then I want to remind the viewers and listeners who weren't alive in 2015 about your previous two books.
Well, Motherlove came to be actually in some ways because of one of my earlier books, Boy with a Knife. There's actually two stories I'm going to tell you that have to do with how Motherlove came to be. The first one is when I was working on Boy with a Knife about Carter Reed, which was in 2016, that book was published, and I met his mother, and it was my first experience with someone who was incarcerated, really getting to know their mother, and I learned how Sharon had been, her house had been, after he went to prison, her house had been stoned. She had to take her kids out of school. And it was really kind of horrible, the amount of trauma she went through. So that was the first story. The second is, and it got me into feeling I wanted to understand the mothers, the family, but particularly the mothers of people who were incarcerated, and in this case, for murder. Later, I went to a parole hearing, and in Massachusetts, you can go to life or parole hearings, and I've been to about 50 of them because I write about parole. And this hearing was in 2014, and during my research with Carter, but it was before the book came out, and the person was Kima Mack, a young man, also a young man at the time of the murder he committed, and his mother was in the, at the parole board for his hearing. And they have it set up so that there's like a rope, and on one side, I think of it as a bad wedding, on one side of the aisle are the people who are supporting the person seeking parole, on the other side are the people who are against it. In this case, in the middle of the hearing, Kima's mother stood up and asked for forgiveness from the mother of the young man who Kima had killed. And they had known each other when they were kids. She asked for forgiveness, and the mother gave her forgiveness. And it was something I had never seen before. And
during the parole
During the hearing. That
Wow.
just upended the hearing, and the board didn't know what to do, and it was a moment I call of restorative justice, meaning that there was a real restoration, a real sense of connectedness, a real sense of trying to make up for something that you can never make up for. Kima, of course, was crying, and it was a phenomenal thing. So I wrote about that for my blog in 2014, which was nonfiction. And then I didn't feel satisfied with that. So 2017, I don't really know what happened exactly why, but I was thinking about this mother, and I sat down and I started to imagine what would it be like her getting ready for the parole hearing. And I gave her a hat, a red hat. And I have a drama background, a theater background, and I very much understand the importance of props. And so that hat became something for me to feel through Marie. I began feeling what I imagined Marie would feel.
Before this happened, had you ever really thought about the mothers or the parents of both sides, really, the victims and the perps?
The victims are, people think about that, not just me. There's tons of information about and I call them so-called victims because I believe there are victims on the side of the so-called perpetrators.
Right.
And so I think those distinctions are false. But using that term, the victims are very publicized in the news. What's not publicized are the mothers of people who have harmed people so much. They're not so publicized. So this was really, as I said, an accumulation of thinking. Carter's mother and Kima's mother led to my thinking more about mothers. I think that fiction happened because it wasn't enough for me to just use fact. I needed to somehow fictionalize. I have written plays, 2 plays actually, but I hadn't ever written fiction, published fiction novels or short stories. So this is my first effort in that vein.
So how many of the stories here come from parole? I mean, you've attended 50 parole hearings. That's really a large number for someone who is not personally, let's say, involved with either side. How many stories came from what you were able to see at parole hearings, or did you interview any mothers?
Actually, I have 2 answers to that question. I did talk to some mothers who I got maybe a line from or an idea from or something from. Nothing in the book is actually factual, but nothing in the book is 100% fiction, in the sense that I believe very strongly that most fiction writers use fact to inform their fiction, and I believe that most nonfiction writers fictionalize a bit. Because even I think when you're remembering dialogue, you don't remember it exactly.
Right.
So you recreate it to what feeling, theme you want to get across. And in this case, if you look at any story, I could tell you the kernel of fact that's in the story, because there is in almost every story something. One line, one fact. You know, some have a little more than others. The one we're talking about, Marie, is really based on the parole hearing that I went to. And then, of course, Marie is fictionalized and her family's fictionalized and all that happened is fictionalized, although I managed to get a couple things right when I met Kima, the real Kima, after he got out of prison. And he was at that event that you attended in Porter Square. He told me that his mother really did work for the MBTA, which I had her working for the MBTA, and I had no idea that was true. Now, maybe I heard that at the parole hearing or something. Maybe it was something that stuck in my mind, but I don't remember it at all.
So how was writing fiction, how different was it for you? Did you have trust in yourself that you would be able to be as successful a fiction writer as you were a nonfiction writer? Or as happy with what came out of your effort?
I have to say, I think most writers, we kind of never know whether someone's going to respond, or I never know if anything is, quote, good or not. I mean, I don't think about that when I'm writing.
But you know what your own feeling about it is.
Well, I do know that I felt incredibly engaged in trying to, these things that were nonfiction flooded into me as I was writing. And I also felt the stories came in a rush. Although I do enormous amount of research, Eileen, like I what I wanted to say is, like, I made up, I would decide, each woman takes place in a different community in the Massachusetts area. And so I would travel to, say, Springfield and find the house where my character lived, and then go walk around to find the restaurants where she would have inhabited, so I would have a feeling a little bit of the world she lived in. And that is not, I do think some fiction writers do that. One of my friends, Caroline Levitt, who has a new book out right now, wonderful book, she was telling me how she's writing a book about the 20s, and she's trying to research what canapes were actually in the 20s. So I think it's true that we have to find these small things that are accurate. When I have one character in this book who becomes a nun. Now, that was a shock to me since I'm Jewish. It never occurred to me, but it happened because it was the right path for her to go on. Now, did I understand becoming a nun? Yes, I have a friend who was a nun, who became a layperson for a bunch of different reasons, but she told me a lot about being a nun. And two, I have worked in this program, Changing Lives Through Literature, with a judge, Catholic judge, knew his family, learned a lot about Catholicism. The woman who married my father's second marriage is Catholic. So I have some experience in that vein, but I was still surprised, always surprised by my stories.
That was a very poignant moment in that story. It was like she had done what she could in her earthly realm, and now it was time to try something new. Is there a common strain that you find between all the mothers in these stories, other than, the fact that their sons have been,
or daughter,
one daughter, have gone off, the path? Is there any other commonality, do you think?
I think the mothers, well, first of all, Motherlove, they all love their children unconditionally. Love doesn't necessarily mean acceptance, and love doesn't necessarily mean approval, but they love them. I think they'll blame themselves. That's one thing in common. The woman you're talking about is actually grandmother, the one who becomes a nun, not a mother, but she still raised her child, the son. They all blame themselves in some way. They all have the sense of, what could I have done differently? There's anger, I think, with most of the mothers, as well as love, hurt. There's a continual replaying of the stories of their children, and often a replaying of what happened and why, and a questioning. I don't think there's a exact acceptance 100%, because there's so much conflict with it.
So why did you go to 50 parole hearings, out of curiosity?
Well, no, because I write about parole. I write for, it's actually called Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, and Dig Boston came out of that, Horizon Mass. I've been writing for them for some time. Nonfiction.
All right, well, since writing goes hand in hand with reading, and since you mentioned Marie, would you mind doing a short reading from that story?
Sure. I need to set it up a little bit for our viewers, which is, so this is a parole hearing where Marie's son, whose name is Louis, is up for parole, and I think everybody else will explain. Robert's her husband, and James is the young man who Louis killed. Okay. When Marie looked back on this day, weeks after the hearing, while she waited to find out what would happen to her son, She would not think about how angry she had been at Robert for so many months, years really. She could not bear to think that her anger had been visible. "James is not to blame," Lewis had said, in a voice that was new to her. "It doesn't matter that James accused me of stealing his bike or of slacking on my part of our business. It doesn't matter that James yelled or threatened me. None of that matters. What matters is that I shot him. I killed James Stanton. It was my misguided anger." Oh God, Marie had thought to herself, what did we do to make him so angry? What did I do? Lewis continued, "Everything stopped after I shot him, and all I cared about was myself. I didn't want to admit that I killed someone. I fought everyone and everything for 5 years. Marie glanced across the rope at Francine. She could not imagine her pain. It was agony, as her son described what he had done on that awful night. This new voice, she would describe it later as the voice of a man who had grown up with love in his heart, despite the horrors of prison, answered question after question from the board. He had learned to temper his anger, he said, a rage that consumed him when he went to school with white boys who called him the N-word, a rage that festered in prison when fighting was what he had to do to survive in a system where he was beaten up and left in the shower. Marie had flinched when she heard this. She had not dared to look at Robert. She focused instead on how gentle Lewis sounded when he told the board that his faith in Allah had taught him to put himself into the shoes of another. She tried not to feel the sorrow that was just under her skin. A parole board member said, "I believe, Lewis, that you have worked on your anger and that you now care about other people." Another board member said, "You were a child and you acted impulsively, but I am not sure that you understand the ramifications of that action." Oh God, she said to herself, fighting back tears. The first hour was interminable, filled with the crime over and over. After the board members had finished with their questions, Lewis was asked to stand and was told to move to the front row to sit with a correctional officer from the prison, leaving his seat free for those who would testify. She watched him shuffle to his seat. She felt fear rising in her throat. When they swore her in, Marie was shaking. Marie was still shaking as she walked up the aisle. She held her speech in one hand, intending to sit down next to the lawyer, but when she got to the empty chair, she grasped the back of it with her other hand, and then, almost as if she were in a trance, she found herself turning, and facing Francine Stanton. Before she knew it, Marie was speaking. "For years I have wanted to apologize, Francine, for whatever I did to bring my son to that awful place." And she paused to steady herself. "That enabled him to kill." There was some kind of sound behind her, but she went on, pushing Robert out of her mind. "And really, I have wanted to say this to all of you, but Francine, to you in particular, I just didn't know how." There were clogged cries from Patsy. Marie was undeterred. "I ache for the loss of your son, Francine." Francine got to her feet, while her mother began to wail. For a moment, Marie wanted to turn away. Eddie clutched his daughters. Robert's muffled cries were as clear to Marie as if she were next to him. But Francine's voice stopped her. She called out in her direction, "I will never forget that Lewis killed James, but I know you lost a son too." If Marie had looked around the room, she would have seen that members of the board sat fixed in their seats and that Eric Soloway was looking up at her, stunned into silence. No one dared to tell her to sit down and read her speech. But Marie was not looking around the room. She was staring at Francine. "Oh, Lord," Marie began again, "I've wanted to hear you say that for so long. I never dreamed it was possible." "It is possible. It is." Francine steadied herself and turned toward Lewis. "James would light up a room, Lewis. He had a spark, and you put that out. But and here she stumbled. "I forgive you. I hope you have peace in your soul, Lewis. That will help." Marie saw that her son was weeping.
Oh, well, if that was nonfiction, recreation of nonfiction or fiction, it really just it makes you clutch your heart in agony. I just can't even imagine sitting through something like that live, and certainly not expecting it, and both women not expecting anything like that, and the son not expecting, and the parole board. So that's a very dramatic and beautiful scene. And what it did make me think of is the group out of Boston called We Are Better Together, which is the Daniel Hairston project, which was put together by mothers, I think mostly mothers, of murdered children and mothers whose children murdered. And We Are Better Together was exactly what the feeling was in that group. Why should we, could we not do what was done at that parole board hearing? And I think they and other groups had a Mother's March for Peace.
Yeah, the Louis
Brown Peace Initiative.
Yeah.
And we went to that years ago. There weren't many people, and Mayor Menino was there, and that's how long ago it was. But now it has really become, a kind of community show of love and grief. Mm-hmm. And so I think your expression of that was really beautiful in that passage.
That is a great segue into, in my book, well, it's published by Concord Free Press, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but in my book, I should say, the Concord Free Press gives away these books for free on you can go to concordfreepress.com and order my book for free. And the reason they give away the books for free is they ask for donations or good deed, and they intend to inspire generosity, which is why I thought they were perfect for my publishing this book. And I have some suggestions in the book of places to give, and one of them is that organization you mentioned. Others are New Beginnings Reentry Services, Mothers for Justice and Equality, and then a couple of out-of-state organizations also. And it's really amazing that people are giving to, they can give to whatever organization, but it's kind of exciting to think my book might raise $40,000 to $50,000 for charity. I don't get paid, but people get money.
So let's hear more about the Concord Free Press, because that sounds like a very radical idea for a publisher.
It is a radical idea, and I think it's so radical that, most authors, and I'm the first woman author that they've published.
Really?
Yeah. They published a book that was a woman in Jenny Slate and her, I think it's her father, but it was not it wasn't a novel or short stories or something. It was to raise money for some organization kind of thing. They have been in business for, I think, 16, 17 years, and Stona Fitch is a writer, and Ann Fitch, his wife, is the editor, basically. She's also done writing and dancing, and they're both very artistic. And Stona has a bunch of books, and so I was impressed, as you were when we talked about this, with their board of directors and the books that they've published. And that made me want to send them my book. And
so you had heard about them?
Well, I'd heard about them from two friends of mine that knew them. Lisa and Laura Burland, their names are, and they had a shop in Concord next to Concord Free Press, so that's how they knew of them.
And so the concept is that they publish your book. There's also a really neat part of the book where you can write down, please sign your copy of Motherlove before you pass it on. So it's like a record. And my first thought was to put it in a little free library, which would be a great. But viewers and listeners, I'm going to let you send me an email and tell me if you would like me to pass on my copy of Motherlove to you, because normally I keep all copies of Books to Authors books, but this one really needs to be passed on.
They also ask that people, when they give donations, go to the website and let them know, so that if they don't put your whole name, so it would say Eileen D. gave X to whatever. So some people are somewhat anonymous, and it's still, you can see all the donations up there, which is a kind of wonderful to see what people think and what they want to give to. And like, one of my friends from England got the book, and she wrote me about an organization in England she's going to give to, and that's interesting, very interesting. We're not privy to that normally.
So did you have an editor there? Do they function like a regular?
Oh yeah, Anne's an editor, and so she worked with me on the book. And they also, the people who work for them, they hire and they get people who donate services free. So they have both. They hired an excellent PR firm. They have other copy editors, the person who designed the cover. Just amazing.
Let's talk about the cover for a minute. So I don't know, Maria, if you can get a close-up of the cover. If not, I'll edit one in. But this is like every mom. Yeah. She's standing in a window. Yeah. She's you can just imagine, especially when you read the book, what's going through her head. I just think it's such a beautiful cover.
Yeah, I love the fact that she's looking out. You kind of don't know at what. You definitely don't know at what, but it could be that she is a mother. Also, because she could be behind bars looking at. There's a lot of, it evokes a lot in terms of mother and love. And I love her, whatever that is on the top of her head, which
her
is,
little,
I think,
split ponytail.
Hair,
yeah, we used to wear her hair like that. So there were not many fathers were in this book. Is that based on your experience of attending parole hearings, or did you have a specific reason for focusing in on the mothers?
Well, I don't want to say that all my experience in the criminal legal system comes from parole hearings, because, as you know, I taught in prison for 10 years, and I have really I've been doing programs with women on probation for 30 years. So my experience with women is that many of the men don't stick around. Now, that's not across the board, and it's not fair. But it's true of a lot of people that I met, that I've met. When I say men don't stick around, it's harder. I think it's harder in a different way for a father when his son goes to prison than it is for a mother. It's a different.
How so?
Well, I think in most cases it has more failure attached to it, and
because the father's more responsible if it was a son?
Perhaps. I don't want to say exactly responsible, because it's a different kind of, the mother's guilty, but the father, there's, what is it? Men have a little more trigger of anger than women do in general, and a different kind of disappointment of your son. And not always true, because some fathers, like Carter's father, was in prison when his son, committed a crime. So he was a terrible role model. So there's that too. But I didn't explore fathers, so I don't know as much about fathers. I wanted to explore mothers just because in our society, mothers often are more responsible for their children than fathers. Not good, not bad, but true.
That makes sense to me. What are you working on next?
I wrote a novel during COVID. I don't know, I'm trying to, I'm not going to talk about it because it's bad luck to talk about your novels before they're published. But I do a lot of writing. I'm working on an investigative piece about the Governor's Council, which should be interesting because there's a lot of races for Governor's Council this year, and that's a very important body in Massachusetts that most people don't know about.
When we're getting low on time, but I wanted to ask you more about classes behind bars. It seems to me that you were am I wrong? You were in the vanguard of this. There are many, many programs now that did not exist when you brought Shakespeare behind bars.
That's so funny that you say that, Eileen, because this year I didn't know this year I discovered for someone's research that I was the first person in Massachusetts to do Shakespeare behind bars.
I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that at all. But I really feel like, well, it depends on what state you're in, probably. I'm not speaking for Arkansas or Missouri, but it seems to me that there has been an improvement in allowing people to get degrees while they're in prison, in prisoners, incarcerated people just wanting to take classes. There are tremendous wait lists, there are security issues, but you were really in the vanguard of that, and I'm very proud of you for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm sorry that time was short, but thank you, Jean, for joining me after 11 years. And I just wanted to tell you all that this book is available through Concord Free Press, or I'll put the information at the end of the episode. And it's also available through me, so get in touch, let me know if you'd like it. And I think what I'm going to do for my donation is I'm going to buy some copies, and I'm going to give it to Prison Book Program in Quincy, Mass., which I've had them on the show and support them. And I think this would be great to get these books into the hands of incarcerated people. So Jean, thanks again. Books to viewers and listeners. This was, I hope you really appreciated the thought Jean put into nonfiction, fiction, fiction, nonfiction, and the effort and who she is representing here with this book, this collection of stories. So have a good night.